Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon to you all. Thank you so much for that very generous and kind introduction. It's a real honour for me to be talking with you all today, and thank you for taking your time to be with me and listen to this discussion. I'm really looking forward to hearing about the experiences in Hong Kong and some of the questions or comments that you all have. I just wanted to start, but Kerry has already outlined briefly what it is we're talking about. I'm going to talk a bit about the cyberflashing and why we're talking about it. So when I use the term cyberflashing, I'm talking about individuals, and it's mostly men, sending penis images to another person, usually commonly a woman, without their consent. It's sometimes often also called sending unsolicited dick pics. And it's often perpetrated using Bluetooth or AirDrop, where you can exchange images within a short distance of someone else through your smartphone. But it's also common, as I'll talk about, on online social media and dating apps. And I guess one of the questions is, why are we talking about it? I'll come on to talk about how common it is. But I think in essence, many women have just had enough of this sort of everyday sexual harassment, and that includes cyberflashing. And we've seen that, I think, since the Me Too movement, that questions are being asked about why are we having to deal every day with often seen as minor forms of sexual harassment, but cumulatively they can be very significant. So I think there's just an appetite for change and for saying enough is enough. So today here, this is what I briefly want to share with you, these different points and elements. And I just wanted to start by saying what I'm talking about today draws on research I've done with my colleague Kelly Johnson, and we published a short book on this not that long ago. And so it's with her, drawing on her work as well. So I want to talk about how common is cyberflashing. I'll talk about the different circumstances in which it takes place, the harms. I want to try and ask the question about why men would send unwanted penis images, and then talk about the role of the criminal law. I am going to be predominantly talking about the experiences of men sending these images to women. There are other contexts, particularly on dating apps used by men seeking to have or meet other men. And that is a slightly different experience, which I'm not going to address in any detail. I'm focusing on this particular situation of men sending images to women. So just very briefly outline about how common cyberflashing is, and it's unfortunately alarmingly common. There's been a number of studies and surveys done internationally about online harassment experiences, and some ask about cyberflashing as well. This is just one study from a few years ago in the UK, which began to raise this as a real issue, because you'll see that almost half of young women aged 18 to 36 had been sent an unsolicited penis image. And that rose to 47% for those slightly younger. This is mirrored in many other studies internationally. You often find about half of young women have been sent genital images without their consent. There was also actually a study just recently in the UK of teenagers, and so teenage girls, they found 75%, so almost all teenage girls had been sent a penis image without their consent by strangers or peers. So it is a very common experience. I just want to then talk about, it's so common, in what sorts of circumstances is this taking place? How and why is it happening? And there's a few different types of circumstance. The first one, and this is often what policymakers first think about when they think of cyberflashing, and that's on public transport and in public spaces. I've just got here a couple of quotes from some women who shared their experience of cyberflashing. And you can see that Joanna talked about how she was sitting at a bus stop when the dick popped up on her screen out of nowhere, suddenly found herself looking around and got this creeping feeling that she was being watched, but she couldn't see anyone. This is this fear of the unknown. Rachel talked about traveling home alone by bus when a dick pic popped up into my phone. In the space of a second or two, I was confused, shocked, disgusted. So it's often on public transport, but it's also, you know, women queuing for coffee in the supermarket, lots of public, in the shopping centre, lots of public spaces where this is happening to women. But it's also very common in dating apps, and experiences of this will obviously vary around the world in different countries, different dating apps. These are a couple of quotes from women. Francesca talked about it, such a prominent thing in the world of modern dating. For her, it had become the norm. Cara talked about, I couldn't even tell you how many times I've been sent dick pics on dating apps without her asking, which is the key. They always seem to be sent randomly and out of nowhere. And then this is also interesting. Guys start seeming off mega chilled, have a good chit chat, and then bam, a penis image comes into the inbox. But again, on dating apps, particularly very different contexts for men. Although I would say about the online dating apps used by men seeking sexual activity with other men, it is actually still against their terms and conditions to send penis images without consent, even though some people talk about it being more acceptable. So anyway, this third context about social media and online activities, again, is just another avenue where women are subjected to cyberflashing. And so this is from known and often unknown men in social context, but also professional context. And that's also the significance. Most of us use social media in a professional context as well. So Melanie talked about being sent an unsolicited penis image out of the blue on Facebook by an estranged family friend. Amy talked about a Facebook message containing a naked, full frontal image of a man who just interviewed her for a job. She hadn't even been told yet what had happened about the job interview, but he sent her this image. A journalist, Rosalie, talked about going on Twitter to try and find out various bits of information. And then one man just proceeded to send her three different videos of him masturbating and ejaculating. And then over the last few years, we've seen Zoom bombing and Zoom flashing, where men are exposing themselves or distributing sexually explicit material in online meetings and webinars. So these are just some of the varied contexts, I think, in which cyberflashing takes place. And perhaps you can also then see why it's incredibly common, because it's happening across all these different platforms. And I guess that then leads to the question that many of us are often asking, why are men sending penis images, unwanted penis images, to women? And the motivations are obviously overlapping. It's a very complex issue. There's never one factor that motivates someone like in sexual offending. And obviously culturally, it will vary as well, depending on the different cultural contexts. But let me give you a few of the suggested motivations that come out of some of the research. The first and most predominant one is when people talk about transactionally motivated. In other words, they're sending a penis image in the hope of getting something in return, either another image or some form of sexual activity at some stage. And this is a quote from a man who's been sending unwanted penis images. He said, "I felt good about it, from the validation and the boost to my self-image, but also the precedent it opened up. It was now okay for them to reply in kind or to steer the conversation down more sexual routes." One study by Oswald and others found that nearly half of men declared, so this is self-declaration, motivated by the hope of getting sexual images in return. 1/3 hoped for a sexual encounter. Another offender said that if after a brief chat he didn't get a response, he would sometimes send the dick pic because he then thought, well, they might have lost interest, so what have I got to lose? So in other words, people sometimes talk about this as a numbers game, men just sending out large numbers of penis images in the hope that someone, somewhere, will respond positively. And when even one does, that seems to be worth it for them. There is then the context of sexual arousal and exhibitionism. And this is where there are closer links between cyberflashing and physical exposure or indecent exposure on the streets. So some links to kind of compulsive or abnormal sexual gratification from exposure. And technically that might often be called exhibitionism. And there you've got the similarities with flashing. So this study by Oswald interviewing men found that almost 25% had sent the penis images, said it had turned them on. 8% said I get off, well, acknowledge I get off on the knowledge, excuse me, sorry. I get off on the knowledge that someone was forced to see my penis without their consent. And this is identifying that some men getting sexual arousal from non-consent and from the shock and surprise and from the victim's fright, which is obviously disturbing, although not surprising when we know of the prevalence of non-consensual pornography on mainstream porn sites, for example. There's whole genres and whole areas on some of the very largest porn sites about non-consensual sexual material. And then there is a motivation to threaten, harass, or cause distress to individuals. So another study here, 31% thought that women would find them distressing, and a slightly smaller percentage threatening, but they're still sending them. Oswald, many perpetrators hoped to provoke negative reactions. And here you can see about reactions of shock, fear, disgust, and some of them liked feeling in control. And obviously there's overlaps between these different elements, but this is another factor in what's driving some men to send penis images without consent. And I guess, you know, underpinning many of these acts and motivations is this idea of a kind of dominant or hegemonic masculinity. You know, it's often about asserting a status, or it's an entitlement, you know, they're entitled to do this, a form of aggression. And it's almost that society and our culture encourages this because it encourages this active or aggressive expressions of sexuality. It is also sometimes, and you see this particularly with younger men or teenagers, boosting the status amongst the peers. So boys both sharing nudes and also cyberflashing, boosting their status, their kudos amongst their friends. And of course it's complex, just to emphasize that again. So if we've thought about, you know, the commonality and why men might be doing this, I also just want to emphasize some discussion around the harms of cyberflashing and what some women, why is it so problematic, really? Why am I talking about it today? Why are we talking about the criminal law? And the first point to make is the varied nature of the harms, obviously, of cyberflashing. It is gendered. Women, particularly young women, are the main targets. It is often accompanied by other sexual violence and harassment, and certainly the threat of that. But I also want to emphasize that it's intersectional and contextual. So whilst many women experience cyberflashing and the harms vary and are experienced differently by different women depending on their own context. And experiences obviously vary depending on identity and other intersections of race, ethnicity, sexuality, class, disability, and other vulnerabilities. So just bearing in mind that breadth of different experiences. So for example, in the UK, Black women and women from some minority groups experience far higher levels of online sexual harassment and online abuse. In forms of image-based abuse or cyberflashing, sometimes women identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer or trans as well, often experiencing higher levels of abuse. So what is the wrong though? Why is it problematic? And so first off, I want to say it's about, for me, infringing sexual autonomy, the core wrong here is that this is non-consensual sexual conduct. And it breaches an individual, every woman, every person for whom this happens, their right to sexual autonomy. And that's regardless of the perpetrator motive or whether there's any consequential harms. So in other words, it is just a wrong per se to, I think, to send someone a sexual image like this without their consent. So this is from one victim who talked about it just came into my inbox. I had no control over what was happening. I felt kind of shocked and disgusted. It was violating of my personal space and privacy. So I didn't feel like I had an awful lot of autonomy in terms of dealing with the invasion. And I think that captures quite clearly this point about the invasion of sexual autonomy. So another way of thinking about that, and the word violation certainly in English language comes up quite regularly in talking about women's experiences. So one study by Marcotte and others found that 1/3 of women reported feeling violated after being sent unsolicited penis images. And this is the violation of your personal space and of your mobile phone. And I think here, this is what's quite interesting. We need to recognize most of us, excuse me, most of us have our mobile phone with us all the time, don't we? We tend to take it everywhere with us. It's always there. And it's almost a part of us because it is, we use it professionally, we use it personally. And so when someone is sending you this violating image right to your mobile phone, it can feel very personal and it is invading a very personal private space. And this links to the broader ideas of online abuse, because what for many of us, our phone or being on the internet is sometimes a form of social interaction. For some women particularly, but anyone who's victimized by online harassment, the online world and their phone can then become a site of trauma. And that's why it's so deeply problematic. The other key harm that women often experience is this the sense of fear and threat that comes when you receive an unwanted penis image. And it's this question of, well, what might happen next? So a couple of quotes here from women, say one who said, the first one, it was scary not knowing who it was, that they might be looking at me or potentially following me off the train. You've got someone here who's doing this and it could escalate. So this is very similar to women's experiences of physical flashing. And the point is, you just don't know what this person's going to do. Well, first of all, with cyberflashing, you don't know who it is. You don't know what they want, what's their plans, and what are they going to do next. And this is where Handler and Saunders talk about women's well-founded fears of what might happen next, and how sexual exposure may promote fears of injury and death to women because of this uncertainty about what may happen next. So Liz Kelly has talked about women are not harmed here simply by a penis image. It's not about being offended or, you know, some sort of moral offense at seeing a penis image. It's because of the explicit or implicit threat of further assault. And so all of these harms come together cumulatively. They come together as an overwhelming experience of everyday harassment. So B.B. John talks about women's right to everyday life. All of us have a right to everyday life, which online abuse and harassment impacts on. And cyberflashing is just part of this much wider experience of harassment and abuse. So Kate talked about it felt like cyberflashing was another harassment that women have to absorb. One woman talked about, I know men think women should just avoid these microaggressions, that it's not so constant, just turn off social media. But why can't she just use Facebook? And Liz Kelly and Fiona Vera Gray talking about how this kind of harassment reduces women's space for action. In other words, it narrows down your world because of the options open to you are reduced. So thinking therefore about what might our responses to cyberflashing be? And internationally, over the last few years, there has been a growing focus on the role of the law and the role of the criminal law in relation to cyberflashing. So I think if we think of criminal laws and cyberflashing, there's broadly two main categories. The first are general criminal laws, which could be used in some cases of cyberflashing. So for example, in many countries, many laws on harassment could cover some cases of cyberflashing if there is persistent and repeated behaviours. In many countries, there's laws on malicious communications, which are used for online abuse more generally, and some of those will cover cyberflashing. And then some countries have other often sexual offences that could include this. So for example, Sweden has a law on sexual molestation and intrusion, which can include cyberflashing. Ireland has a law on offensive conduct of a sexual nature that's sufficiently broad that could cover cyberflashing. But many of these laws, as many of you will know, have various thresholds and criteria that mean that cyberflashing can fit sometimes, but often it doesn't. And also often victims and law enforcement do not know that those laws could cover cyberflashing. So what we've seen in recent years is a growing number of specific offences targeting these activities, cyberflashing in particular. So in the United States, Texas was one of the first to introduce a criminal law targeting cyberflashing, and a number of other states in the United States have now adopted similar laws. And recently, there's also been a trend towards civil offences for cyberflashing. A few years ago, Singapore introduced a new cyberflashing offence. Northern Ireland in the UK has done similarly. And as we've heard, ongoing in England and Wales, here in the UK at the moment, we're debating whether to introduce a specific law on cyberflashing. I guess this raises the question, you know, why a criminal law? Why am I talking about a criminal law? Well, these are just some of the potential reasons why I think a specific law on cyberflashing can help make it really clear that this conduct's wrong and potentially harmful. I think the criminal law here does provide this foundation of saying what is effectively what's right and wrong in society. I think it does also, or it can also, send a message to victim survivors to let them know that their experiences are understood and recognised. It can make prosecutions more straightforward. And I think it can provide the right foundation for education and prevention initiatives. But I do want to emphasise there are obviously risks of criminalisation in which we need to balance. There is a problem with over-criminalisation, the use of the criminal law for social problems. But I think what we also need to recognise is that in most countries, there's an under-criminalisation of women's harms. There is disproportionate targeting of some groups, and in the UK, particularly Black and minoritized women and men with the criminal law. And often punitive punishment levels, it does not support behavioural change. And so it is important to emphasise alternatives. So let me just very briefly identify what's been happening in England and Wales. There has been over the last year a campaign to change the law in England and Wales. I've got a slide here in the yellow, Don't Be a Dick, which is a campaign by the dating app Bumble, UN Women, and media magazine Grazia to make cyberflashing illegal. And I've been working with them on that. The Huffington Post report at the bottom, the journalist Sophie Gallagher has done a lot to raise awareness about the nature of this problem. And then there's a photograph there of me trying to persuade our members of parliament and politicians to introduce a law, together with colleagues from women's organisations, Refuge, which works with domestic abuse, and the End Violence Against Women Coalition. I guess I should say that there's actually today in our Parliament, the provisions on cyberflashing are being debated. So we're still waiting to see what's going to happen. But just to finish, the criminal law I see is only ever it's only ever a first step, it's only ever a foundation, it is not the solution, it is not what's going to make a significant difference, it's part of the picture. But what is obviously also needed is education and prevention programs. We fundamentally need more support for victims as well, and that's both to report if they want to, but also to help them understand their experiences. This is a Report It to Stop It, a still from the organisation that runs London's transport to encourage women where they can to report unwanted sexual harassment. And another picture, Don't Be a Dick, from a sex education charity, again, trying to work with young people to encourage men not to send dick pics without consent. So these sorts of campaigns and programs absolutely fundamental to helping us change our culture, and vital work that I think needs to start as soon as possible. So thank you very much for that today. And I look forward to our discussions.
Yeah, I'm Jacey from Association Concerning Sexual Violence Against Women in Hong Kong. So we are a non-government organization that works to raise awareness of sexual violence against women and promote a gender equal environment. And of course, we also advocate for law and the policy change, as well as provide a all-round supportive service to victim survivors of sexual violence. So before I begin to share a bit on the Hong Kong situations, I would like to express my deep respect and sincere appreciation to Professor McGlynn, because your works and the research on image-based sexual abuse has huge impacts on us in Hong Kong. And in fact, in the past few years, we've been promoting the concept of image-based sexual abuse, and also to translate it into Chinese, so as to let more and more people in Hong Kong to know more about this concept and this idea. And so but apart from learning and inspired by the works of Dr. McGlynn, we promote the concept, and at the same time, we also advocated for the law reforms in Hong Kong. So in year 2021, there was a amendment bill introducing the image-based sexual abuse offences that was being passed in that year and also came into effect accordingly. And those offences are voyeurism, unlawful recording or observation of intimate parts, and publication or threatened publication of intimate image without consent. So I know today's topic's about cyberflashing, but because it's still kind of rare in Hong Kong or in our casework, so I want to focus back on our works on image-based sexual abuse by sharing the experience that we advocated for law reform, and when the laws came into effect, they were implemented, what kinds of good sides and limitations we see in the legal system, along with the multifaceted perceptions of justice amongst our victim survivors. So by this sharing, I want to highlight the function, the roles, and at the same time, the restrictions of criminalization in the context of nuance and complexity of the casework of sexual violence. So first of all, just want to share that although the laws have been passed and came into effect, we see a lot of gaps of seeking justice in the criminal law system. So first of all, there were still many victim survivors being rejected by the criminal system, where the police refused to open file or to start an investigation. And secondly, we see that the prosecution rate is very undesirable. So for example, since the law came into effect in October 2021 till the end of 2022, the prosecution rate of voyeurism and non-consensual taking of intimate parts, the prosecution rate was between like 20 to 30%. And worse still, for the offense of non-consensual distribution or threatened distribution, the prosecution rate is as low as 2% only. So it is obviously not desirable. And thirdly, just like UK, to establish the offense in Hong Kong, there's a requirement for the proof of motivation of the abusers. So for example, for voyeurism, it should be proved that it is for sexual purpose if no intimate parts were being captured in the images. And for non-consensual taking offense, it is required to establish the element that the abuser does the act for dishonest intent or for sexual purpose. As for the non-consensual sharing or threat to share offense, it is required to establish the element that the abusers does the act so as to, with the intention to cause humiliation, distress, or alarm. So this is another gap or the undesirable thing that we see in the legal system. And the fourth is these offenses are now not yet a sexual offense. I mean, they are just criminal offense. So in other words, it means that they are not regarded to be a kind of violation of one's sexual autonomy or sexual intrusion from the perspective of the law enforcement or the government. Despite the limitations or the gaps that we see in the criminal justice system, it is still very important for us to get the policy or law response by making these abusive behaviors an offense in the provision. But instead of just sanctioning outcomes, we want a policy and the law recognize the harms and the traumas caused by the behaviors of image-based sexual abuse. And another significance is to bring changes to the government and the law enforcement authorities, as well as to have some interactions with the pre-existing procedures, languages, and the frames in the legal system. So taking the example of the proof of motivation, in the Hong Kong's criminal justice system, there's still an emphasis, which is very obvious, or emphasis that to establish the offense, there should be an element of motive. So but just like I just mentioned, that the main objective for us to advocate law reform is to gain recognition of harms in the institutions. So, while we respond to the government position or respond to these pre-existing frame of the legal system, so we were very hard, trying to think like, how do the motivations relate or not relate to the harms of the harms or the traumas of sexual violence. So I think this pre-existing framework in the criminal law, which emphasized the motive or the motivation, had indeed triggered us to think over this. And while we respond to the government perspective or these existing framework of the legal system, we are actually enriching our discourse on the trauma by stressing that actually the source of trauma lies on non-consent instead of motivations. But due to the diversity and the complexity of the sexual violence cases and our frontline experience, we are very conscious that the legal redress is just one of the many choices that the victim survivors actualize their own vision of justice. So just like Professor McGlynn said that it is a start, it is it is part of the whole picture. So and actually, in the book that McGlynn you wrote on cyberflashing, there was very well said paragraph that you mentioned that by criminalizing cyberflashing, the aim is to develop policy that does not prioritize or prefer criminal sanctioning or treat criminal law as the best way forward, but to have it as one of many options, albeit one that can provide a foundation for condemning conduct. So this is also our perspective or our vision in our, frontline works assisting victim survivors. And I also noticed that apart from image-based sexual abuse, Professor McGlynn also had done very amazing work and on the study on the Kaleidoscopic justice. So, which mentioned in the journal article, Kaleidoscopic justice, sexual violence and victim survivors' perceptions of justice, which was published in 2019. So, Kaleidoscope is a toy that is a optical instrument with two or more reflecting surfaces, usually the mirrors, inclined to each other in an angle. So in Chinese, it is 万花筒, 万花筒. So I think it is a very great conceptual framework for us to also, apply or to summarize the works that we do in assisting the victim survivors of sexual violence. So I just quote one sentence from the journal article on the Kaleidoscopic justice. It is said that kaleidoscopic justice is justice as a constantly shifting pattern, continually reflected through new experiences and perspectives. Justice as a pluralistic, lived, evolving experience. Embedded within this pluralistic conception of justice, a number of key justice themes, elements of the kaleidoscope emerged, namely consequences, recognition, voice, dignity, prevention, and connectedness. So I think it is a very good inspiring conceptual framework that to inspire the society to think about what is justice, or is it criminal justice the only way that the victim survivors seek justice? And in fact, from our observations or our caseworks of the victim survivors of sexual violence, we see that their perceptions of justice is not actually between themselves, the victim and the abuser, but it's more between the victim and their community and the victim and their inner self. For example, many of them actually want, after the sexual assault happened, they want their significant others recognize the harms and the pains they suffer and stand on their side. And they also don't want to affect their friends and family or their circle, their social circle. In particular, for the cases of online harassment, online sexual harassment, it is quite often that the abuser not just harass the victim survivor, but also their friends and their intimate partners and their family, so as to, exert pressure and intimidation to the victims. And not only they don't want to, affect their friends and family, they also have the vision of justice that they want to, forgive themselves. Quote unquote, forgive themselves and find their inner peace. Because many would at first have a huge doubt in their mind that, is it my fault? Is it my wrong that I make the sexual violence happen? In particularly under the victim blaming culture. So many of them just want to find some peace in themselves. And also for the cases that the intimate images being circulated online, they just want to put a stop to the circulation and to put a stop on the online abuse. And for those who choose to report the case to police, making the abuser being punished is actually not their ultimate aim, but to prevent another girl being victimized. I mean, they don't want another woman suffers the same things like they do by putting the abuser to the legal system. And also to uphold their dignity by fighting back and making their voices heard. And also to reclaim control in the relationship where they are of lower power position. And also to help other girls to help other girls by speaking out their experiences and by spreading the message that they are not alone. So for many victim survivors, actually the above mentioned aims is their own vision of justice. But then seeking legal redress is one of the very important means for them to actualize their own perception of justice. And so I think the conceptual framework that Professor McGlynn raised on the Kaleidoscopic justice very effectively captures the breadth, the variety, complexity, and the dynamism of sexual violence victim survivors' understandings and perceptions of justice. So even though today I know the topic is about cyberflashing, I share a lot on the our experience on advocating the laws on image-based sexual violence. And after the laws being in place and being implemented, we see the good sides and the limitations of the legal justice system, along with the a wide variety of perceptions of justice amongst the victim survivors. So I want to, bring a perspective that about the function, the role, and also the limitation of criminalization in the nuance and the complexity of casework. And I think this is also this could also apply in the case of cyberflashing, which is going to be a law in the UK. So yeah, this is some of my views and my feedback. Yes.
And first, just to say thank you to Jacey. That was so interesting and really thoughtful and reflective, I think, of victim survivors' perspectives, and that varied, when we start from the position of experiences of sexual violence, we have to think holistically. And you've talked about, civil remedies, about education, about the criminal law. And often it's very similar, victim survivors coming forward because they want to try and stop this happening to someone else, isn't it? It's so thank you very much for that. I was really interesting. And you talked about the law in Hong Kong being based around the motivations, which I share your concerns about as well. And that's still the case, as as Cherry says, in the UK, where you have to prove these motivations for specific offences. And what we find is that's what means the police are far less likely to take the cases forward, because even if you think that that's why someone did it, you also have to have the evidence to prove it, which is difficult. And you're right that the current proposed cyberflashing offence in the UK is also based on the motivations. And so what we will see, therefore, is that it will be limited to only certain cases, and it'll be very difficult to prosecute in practice because you won't actually have the evidence of that motivation. I think, as Jacey said as well, the wrong is non-consent, and that should be the foundation for the criminal law.
We have a question from the chat box, and since most cases of cyberflashing and other forms of image-based sexual violence take place on social media platforms, I wonder if those platforms can make any changes in their regulation policies to prevent sexual harassment. And the Bumble case is really interesting, as you mentioned in your presentation slides. I was wondering if what have they been doing? What did you advise them doing?
That's a really good and important question, because And again, that goes to the point about the criminal law is just one aspect of this. Actually, if we're going to secure some real change around online harassment and abuse, it is getting the platforms to do an awful lot more. In the context of cyberflashing, yeah, the dating app Bumble developed its own technology to blur penis images. And so on that app, you can't get sent the images directly. You know, they're blurred, and or you have various choices about what to do. And some other apps are now using similar technology. So I think it's a really good example of where that app, which was founded by a woman, you know, it has safety at its heart and developed that technology accordingly. And far more like that could be done, I think, so that's the technology that could prevent some of these forms of harassment. And then it's also about the platforms doing more to remove things like the image-based abuse that Jacey was talking about. Because sometimes women, that might be your experience as well, it's very hard to get the platforms to even remove some of this material. It can often take a long period of time, or you have to go through certain avenues. It's too complicated at the moment to get material removed by those platforms, and they should be doing an awful lot more.
Jacey, I know Rain Lily has a takedown service that you guys provide. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, we offer the since year 2021, we offer the takedown assistance to the victim survivors of non-consensual distribution, and yes, I think that the platforms, I mean the online platforms, the social media companies do play a very key role in reducing or eliminating the problems. And what I observe is that the issue is always, you know, talking amongst the NGOs, the scholars, but rarely the online platforms or the tech companies are involving in the discussion or the initiatives. But I think it's very good that in the past few years we've been seeing a lot of, you know, leading social media companies are, you know, taking some initiative in this regard by making specific policy and guidelines targeting the non-consensual distribution, and at the same time, and to invent some innovative technology that could prevent the problems. But at the same time, we also encounter some difficulties or barriers to make the to make the social companies to take more and more responsibility. So first of all, for example, for online sexual harassment, including image-based sexual abuse, it is actually a very wide spectrum of behaviors involved. I mean, from doxing to making rape threats to gender trolling on a lot of social forums, online platform. I mean, there involves a huge, a wide variety of behaviors, and sometimes we find it, difficult to, if we want them to have policy or guidelines targeting these behaviors, then what kinds of behaviors that we want them to target? So sometimes we find it a little bit difficult to establish our discourse or our terminology. This is one. Another one is we do observe that the awareness amongst the internet industry on this issue is relatively low compared with the, for example, the children's pornography, children's sexual material problems. So I think the awareness on the adults issue of online sexual harassment is relatively low, and so this is our impression, and so we find it a little bit difficult to ask them to have establish some practices or guidelines in this regard, but then we do think that there shall be more and more discussions in the internet industry or the tech companies, and also to establish the industrial practices, and also some some role model in this regard. For example, like Meta. So I think this is what we see. the future actions will be, or our efficacy strategies will be in the future. Yeah.
Question that I've been thinking about, because I think in the context of sexual harassment, I think the biggest convincing to do is to show that the harm is serious enough to warrant legal regulation. And I remember reading about a recent US Supreme Court case, Counterman versus Colorado. And one of the more disturbing part of it is that I remember reading that the justices in the case are pretty skeptical about the harms suffered by a victim of stalking. And basically, because that case is about First Amendment, so the balance of interest seems to me that is very much tipped towards free speech as opposed to the harm suffered by victim survivors. And I was wondering, for Professor McGlynn, I know one of your research focuses is also on feminist judgments. Do you foresee, or have you already noticed, like there's a tendency of judges trivializing the harms of certain forms of sexual harassment, thus making it more difficult to convince people that sexual harassment is something that warrants criminalization?
Thank you. That I don't know that case particularly you're referring to, but it does sound very troubling, particularly around stalking behaviours, which I would have hoped that by now there would have been a much broader recognition of the serious, harms. Stalking, so often can lead to deaths and homicides, can't it? I think the minimization and trivialization happens across society, and yes, the judiciary and judges, sometimes minimize these harms, but as do politicians, as do friends, colleagues, etc. It's that's why the kind of social campaigns and cultural campaigns are so significant, really, to try and change those perceptions, and why it's we owe so much to the many men and women who do come forward to share how significant their experiences are, to try and change that assumption and culture. I mean, we can point to improvements. There was a case, a civil case in the UK just recently, where a woman brought a claim for damages for having intimate images of her taken and then shared on a porn site without her consent. And she was awarded almost £100,000, which would be, I don't know, about $80,000 US. So it was a significant amount of compensation for the harms she suffered. So, it's a very varied and mixed picture, but without a doubt, there's a lot of work to do to keep getting people to recognize the harms.
For the problems that people minimize or trivialize the harms of sexual harassment, the online sexual harassment or stalking, I guess they're embedded a lot of preconceptions or presumptions of sexual violence. For example, they do have a rank that physical violence will be more severe than non-physical violence, in particularly when it happens in the cyber world, because people assume that, they don't meet in person, or it just stays on the cyber world and doesn't involve any meetup or else. So the harm will be less. I mean, there involves some misconception or some pre-existing thoughts about sexual violence in people's minds, and that is why they would trivialize or minimize the harms. And so, yeah, I agree that we should make the stories or the voices more and more visible to let people know, even though this is non-physical or it involves in the cyber world, it is as harmful as physical violence. And at the same time, so I think if we want to address the issue, we need to debunk a lot of misconceptions about pre-assumptions of sexual violence. And I think that is what we do in our education work or our community work.
Yeah. If people use AI fake images or images of other people to do cyberflashing, will it influence the legal judgment of the case?
in the original proposals in the UK, you were going to have to prove it was a picture of that man's penis that had been sent. And myself and others kind of raised the point of how on earth are we going to have to, the levels of proof to whole new levels to have to prove that. And also the point being, that's not the harm. The harm is more general. So I think, the example June's given of being, a man sending a picture of someone else's penis would apply in the drafts of legislation in most countries I can think of. So it's the picture of the penis, and it doesn't have to be tied to that individual perpetrator being a picture of their penis. So it would apply. AI faked images, again, the law rightly, I think, suggests that if the images have been altered, then it's still the offence is still made out, because otherwise simply altering an image would mean that you avoid legal consequences. And I think particularly with deep fake images, you're right, we need, English law, for example, still doesn't cover deep fake porn. So distributing deep fake porn is not an offence yet. So we have to make sure amended images are covered in any of these laws, I think.
I guess we'll end it here today. Thank you so much to everyone for taking the time to join our webinar. And I hope it has been an inspiring discussion for all of you.